All right. Okay, we're live now. I just want to welcome everyone all to the UTNIF debate on the criminal justice reform topic for the 2020-2021 season. We're excited to bring everyone an example of online debate from two of the most competitively successful teams from high school and college. We have Coppell DR on the affirmative, reading their trademark race war app that saw a lot of success on the competitive circuit in high school last year against top 5 team in the country in college and champions of the Harvard tournament, among numerous other accolades, Kansas BD. And we're super excited to bring you all this opportunity. I think it's gonna be great. So with that, I believe that Het will be giving the 1ACs. So we'll just let Het start it off.
Yep. Is everybody ready? Good, thumbs up. Cool. We're in the midst of a race war, 21st century way of xenophobia and racialized white national hate, except the order modernity re-embodied the inheritance of 1619 manifest discussions of criminal justice reform, 14 eternal debate over the expansions of white humanity and all its hypocrisy, the global promise of white being determines the coordinates of an always unfolding violent society steeped in an edifice of accessibility, narratives of racial progress ignore the pre-established habit for progress extremely tied to white humanity, disestablishment of state craft as a theater, racial nation building, and facilitating movements, sometimes plus civil rights, multiculturalism, and research of white nationalism, post-racial liberalism, law and order, the war on drugs, the war on terror, and infrastructures of tolerance and repression that are never finding except for the resolution question, the call to action, the decision to deliberate over criminal justice reform can only be understood through a frame of white being the condition of possibility for such an action is anti-civilizational echo that position against the legal sociopolitical jurisdictional statutes of modernity. The terms of the internal debate can only allow for the gesture of concession which substitutes a peculiar idiosyncrasies, the notion of policing and equitably a reordering of statecraft and cultural stature that affirms respect for and tolerance for those other lives, a statement of equal turn value that nonetheless endorses the other apartheid principle of human circulation separate but equal. It is within these undertones of the topic synthesis of a perfect arc upon which debate is built. A race war is imbricated not only in the mechanism by which we understand the topic, but the mechanism by which we understand the world around us. The race war is not just out there, but in here. Debate is a microcosm of the race war. The so-called neutrality of clash and predictability are ideological means of entry, which the protocols are not in negotiation competing models, but predetermined by assumptions that probably be internal debate by disavowing those that refuse the protocol. Limits are not just limits on the topic of practices of the community. Clash of citizen debates are refusal to invite certain teams to round robins. Black debaters getting the cops call them because their music is too loud. All prove the uniqueness question of the race war and the inseparability of the internal debate from debate as an activity. Similarly, carciality can no longer be confined to the prison industrial complex, but as expanded to the encompass our epistemological thoughts and provocations. How we are able to relate to one another. The feeling of touch is not neutral, but rather filtered through the carceral regime. Educational spaces like debate are militarized as substance of domestic wars, not through the linguistic reiterations of violence, but also effective in nature. It is a space filled desire to point to policing as something distinct carried out by the state without realizing how students assume the rules of the sovereign and weaponized tactics of policing. Debate is thus not an insulated space to generate clash or a predictable stasis point, but rather a plane in which the race war fought Rodriguez and to the global U.S. U.S. prison regime has become a appropriate condition of schooling, education, pedagogy, and every possible site the person that becomes central to reproduction, reinvention of robust and historical debits. So why you should say the person have up with the capacity to organize social life, including capacity to family, community, school, and individual social students have become conceptualized freedom, safety, peace, and a relative direct outcome of the state conducted domestic war. The prison normalized state of violence of the prison inhibits produces from everyday condition the possibility of teaching us like that notion of prison regime focused on 3 technological processes that are dynamically produced that create informal routines and protocols built towards psychological domination, the domination of privilege and historical anti-black state within the traceable racial slavery. Their prison district components of the multiple knowledges and meanings. Those include circular curriculum of schools, everyday routines, and school bits of discipline. Apply the possibility of imprisonment, the punitive bureaucratic outcome of misbehavior, truancy, and academic failure, teaching no acceptable home, working in policing. I do not think the crucial questions are historical, but which we do not think are totally teaching ultimately challenges material riches. Rather, the primary question is whether now the act of teaching radically displaces and normalized history, everyday suffering. I'm arguing that our historical conditions are generally dictate that our strategic distinction must be drawn. Radical pitches that are able to even remotely justifying defending or tolerating pro-genocidal prison regime that attempts to Abolitionist predatory reducing new categories of identity naturalized outside the school as a state to gifted, talented, undocumented, gang affiliated, exceptional high risk, average who are then by ontological necessity through protocols of pseudo state rights intelligence. This seemingly compulsory side priest reduction on the deadly alienation is also central to the routines the U.S. schooling regime, policing, surveillance, and immobilization are as much schooling practices as their imprisonment practices. The teacher is asked to train foot soldiers, middle management administration, and potential captive of the school, presenting for the school is inseparable from the prison industrial complex. The rise of the prison industrial complex is a direct outcome of the lower progressive prison reform successes of the 1970s. many are taught the freedom in order to administer force and passively reproduce the unfreedom of others. The adjudication of this internal debate is no different than the general symbiosis of cultural, judicial, military statutes that enforce the criminal justice reform as a regulatory mechanism of policing black and brown insurgency. But in this blurs the possibility of a horizon, one that problematizes the political, one that is misimagined and disimagined, echo that shudders the militant insurgency as a decentering of white being, one that asks the question, what would happen if a fleeting moment of anti-state terror was socialized against its sense of congruence? Thus, we affirm military preservation. Military preservation is the unsettling feeling, the opposite flow, one that begins at the moment of sociopoiesis, that harnesses the energy of sociality against a perversive fixation of policy, refuses the violent corrective and violent touch of white being in favor of a new feeling, a haptic relationality, where we open ourselves to the possibility of possibilities, one where we gather dispossessed feelings in common as we undercome the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. This is the field of insurgency, a field that refuses to be regulated under judicial doctrines that dictate the race war and its practice. It's the fugitive feelings of endurance felt by those in the hold of the first logistical cell. It's the reimagination of institutionality by highland people that gathered and wandered, fleeing South Asian party states that refused within each other, becoming ungovernable. This is sapping an individuation that happens via the forceful imposition of arms sales policy without understanding policy as the corrective in debate. It's the incompleteness in our apolitical projects that inclines us towards one another. This is the apositionality being together yet against the very institutions that seek political and logistical control. That's Melbourne. And 16. A performative event repeated with each trading can be a rupture institutionality, work to undo social Latino bench the world to fix us society resistance policy for a form of political control committee to deputize this first form of command which controls social reproduction by taxes correctness for those represent the need of improvement. Mode and Harney counterpose planning to policy. It begins with mode preservation. The state procedurals of policy. Mode and Harney offers sociopathist statement. There's nothing wrong with the logistics, counterpose bodies, objects, affects, information. Logistics, Harney and mode and counterpose have to counter love the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel that feel you. Sociopathtic imagination as a term for non-place of abolition of beneath and beyond the university and habit of maroons, castaways, and fugitives. A positionality being together renews our sense of institutions as a state with a form of appearance of social being. Collectivity is driven through a social action contest. Institutionality can be an anti-utility that empowers to try to inhibit social being. Otherwise, reminding us that radical change requires structure. What does it mean to be militant? Shikaitis and Graeber tells us the imminent process of resistance, one that is the source for social insurgency among the people who refuse to be passive victims of or willing participants in an oppressive system. The requirement that in the midst of the race war and logistics, we have no choice but to analyze, strategize, and act on our surrounding social conditions. Movements are not just obstructions and overlaying circuit points on the global sphere, but ongoing resistance that happen in our thoughts, actions, provocations, and explorations. Our model debate seeks to extend towards new levels of understanding and imminent process of resistance that unleash beautiful insurgencies from the ground up. This is work without a beginning, without an end, a constant planning as opposed to a policy that we take with us wherever we go. Shikaitis and Graeber 7. Investigation and social research, responsibility, political action, the work of military investigation, multiple extended attacks of new levels of understanding, support, progress of collective wandering that's not afraid to admit the question of how to move forward is always uncertain. Military investigation discovered new possibilities with the present to get into its social uncertainty. How we helped compile a book of the essays on Zapatistas when we write or when we read the beginning is not the word but the screen face of mutilation of human lives or theoretical reflection of opposition, negligent struggle from rage thought is born, a liberatory struggle, it's all been struggle against identity, true revolution. Knowledge would have to be a pragmatic form of knowledge that liberal also protected, deeply embedded the logic of truth, racial practice, fierce debates in Latin America, arguments turned into a very particular question of revolution strategy. Who has better model, Zapatista, Chavez, and Bolivarian revolution? The role of the judge to think through a pedagogy of abolition. What is military preservation if not a move towards abolition? Abolition pedagogies are preconditioned to authentic and liberatory social transformations. A world without war and genocide begins here. Students and teachers are instrumental to the operative functions and reproduction of the prison regime. That's Rodriguez. And 10. Deferral of abolitionist pedagogy possibility. Underbred abolitionist pedagogy practice what is required in pedagogical approach that is necessary when possible, and embrace the creative genius. Students locate to studies of abolitionist genealogy, understanding the work connected to living a history, epistemological political revolt. We require sustained analytical discussions that discover multiple layers of knowledge provided, producing a living truth that presents teachers are a dynamic part of the prison regime and reproduction. The abolitionist teachers must be willing to occupy the difficult positions of political leadership in the classroom. How can a teacher expect students to undertake the work of inhibiting abolitionist positionality under the teacher embodies the very same political desires? Abolitionists are radical political position because the formulaic approaches cannot be adequately apprehended by biopolitics, sacred in the violence of genocidal and proto-genocidal systems of human domination, challenging common sense, entails scholarly dismantling of the prison system. The understanding of prison students enter dialogues with a mystified conception of the prison and do not understand the rise of institutional criminalization, domestic war, and imprisonment forms one link of historical change of genocidal mobilization, racist state resistance abolitionist practice derived from epistemological and disciplining political imagination that makes liberatory history must be full combated through pragmatic imperatives that reproduce the political limitations of a non-profit industrial complex. There's no valuable pedagogical position other than the abolitionists want to work. It's time to find by state sanctioned instrumental violence is to understanding abolition practice historical moment is purely pedagogical within against the system which occurs. The present demands of radical pedagogical energies and the precondition of authentic liberatory social transformation. Teachers are institutionally held to the service of genocide and management. Radical teachers are politically held to betray genocidal movements. The short-term survival of the population rendered immediate vulnerable to the violence of the system and long-term survival of the most of the planet's human population securely dependent on our willingness to embrace this form of pedagogical audacity. I'm good.
Cool. Are we good?
Yeah.
We good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. All right. At the top, I guess like what makes debate a place where the race war happens?
Well, we think that it's not unique to debate, but there are violent practices within debate that sustain the race war and its practices, i.e. there are educational models that are upheld that sustain the system of white supremacy that infiltrates and results in.
I guess that brings me to my next question, which is, I guess like what are those practices, and I guess like why does debate make those particular practices unique?
So the idea of deliberating over criminal justice reform from the state-centric frame of what can the USFG do, we would say one is problematic because it disavows the way that sometimes our interpersonal relations of our relations to criminal justice reform should come before the USFG's relations to those things, i.e. it's really easy to say someone else is racist or is problematic without realizing that sometimes it is us who is problematic or racist.
Cool. I guess like, so with that distinction, how does the AF kind of, resolve that kind of instance and tension, specifically through like an abolition pedagogy?
Well, it says that abolition pedagogy is a heuristic to understand our world. It doesn't say that that is the end goal of those movements, i.e. we've endorsed sort of military preservation as a praxis of ongoing resistance that always is happening, but says that a heuristic to understand abolition.
I guess then my next question is like, what makes the AF unique in that moment? If it is just a heuristic to kind of think through the world.
Well, if logistics is inevitable, it's a question of what heuristic we develop. We think the AF's heuristic is good. If it is such, you should vote affirmative.
I guess like what makes logistics inevitable?
Well, we've read a Moden Harney piece of evidence that says that those systems of white supremacy are created through a project of siphoning energy that is needed for its very survival. So the system needs that energy and harnesses black and brown energy in order to survive itself. So as long as that system,
I guess like how does the AF then kind of disrupt those kind of normative understanding or like those kind of traditional anti-black violent logistical means into more radical moments?
That is our argument. It's like that disruption or total disruption is impossible. So it's a question of how we endure in those moments, i.e. it's a question of how we gain in debate specifically a cognitive mapping for interpersonal moments, other moments.
How does the AF provide that?
So we've said that an analytic of military preservation, debt, sociality, loving each other is that analytic of understanding how logistics flows and how we can counteract logistics in that moment.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good then.
Right, sweet.
See, I don't know what that echoing is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Just before you give the 1 and C, you just want to talk for a minute. So something to just think about when you're preparing for this season is the author Dylan Rodriguez, who is featured prominently in Coppell's Race for AF that's written for the criminal justice reform topic, will I think be a big part of the topic. So there are 2 articles to look at if you're interested. The first is the terms of engagement, warfare, white locality, and abolition. The second is the disorientation of the Teaching Act, abolition as pedagogical position. I think there are portions of both articles cited in Coppell's affirmative. I think it's something that everyone who is thinking about this upcoming topic would do well to read. So I think I'm just going to leave it there because it's super early still. So Azja, we're ready for the 1 and C.
Give me 1 second, just because I'm trying to figure out what that echoing is without having to like constantly mess with Kenny and I's like volume. Am I echoing to anyone right now?
No. You sound fine to me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just give me 1 second to get it pulled up. Yeah, okay.
What? Oh, the timer?
And then is everyone good? Cool, it's gonna be 1 off and then the case. And everyone can hear me, yeah? Cool. The one I see is a misdiagnosis of criminal justice reform techniques of criminality and white humanity are unfolded within a meta-strategic rationality of logistical transparency in which one rules with fundamental visibility and mapability is taken as an ontological presumption to be achieved by newer and more sophisticated surveillance and policing techniques, while the affirmative practice of militant preservation resists the concrete technologies of white being. The resistance is articulated as a performance of logistical transparency that reproduces logistics as a terrain of political. There are three links. The first is counter-hegemonic logistics. The affirmative is a part and parcel of a politics of survival and resilience in which only the goal is maintaining the ability to keep fighting this obsession with living to fight another day, abolish strategies of resistance in favor of logistics of a resistance in which the goal is simply surviving to fight. Third, performance of this practice ensures a dark surveillance is captured by the Louisville University that's mounted in Harney. And 13, the capital subject is supporting the area to drive the question of logistics. Logistics is no longer contend with the material world and the formality of the thing proposes, anything proposes to dwell between dwell in nothing. Traditionally strategy led to logistics follows only the ability to keep fighting. Only logistics matters for business. Innovation has become logistical, no longer strategic accumulation of intelligence as never ending warfare. Show me the business innovation and I will show you a workers rebellion. Logistics was after fantasy of the automatic subject that market study about the term human capital not so undisturbed until logistics to dispel strategy but banishing the time to connect with it and without going through the subject. Logistics cannot contain what is regulated to the whole the social capacity to instantiating and then use the shot at the same point unknowable calculates as an absence that cannot be always but always long for the logisticality in the movement of things will not cohere career disorientation the absence of coherence but not of the things. The second is tactical transparency. The affirmative demand for specific alternatives and explicit tactics demonstrates that the performance of very logistical transparency they claim to criticize their resistance is articulated through a grammar of concrete planning utilized by the state governance in Louisville University. Only a refusal of the aesthetics of planning, logistics, and transparency can facilitate fugitivity. That's mounted in Harney. And 9. Policy distinguishes itself from the planning and distinguishing dwelling within the planning because they keep making plans fail because they are policies. The planners are static, essential. They lack perspective. They need vision. They need to have their own sex-sensitive hub. The furtive plans, the furtive plans are too dark in there to see the black. Heart of the multitude of the multitude from the perspective of policy. It is too dark in there to see the black. While the multitude new vision, the planner will become participates. They reject the essence of contingency, planning, the improvisation, flexibility, and fixity, and complexity, simplicity were opposed within the impulse of the composition. Who dwell in policy do not have to be involved in contingency, but writing it. Those who dwell in policy are legible. Policy is a disposition and display policy deposits, curriculum against study deposits, and the policy deposits, the public sphere. The policy's hope is that there will be more policy. There's a danger in all this participation that leads to crisis. We are in the unprecedented crisis, the crisis of participation, the crisis of faith. Those who dwell in the policy will lead the way towards concrete changes in the face of the crisis. They got a secret plan of their own and won't be corrected. Still the plan to be unreconstructed and reconstructing. The third is the affirmative move to refigure blackness from objective consumption to the agent of resistance. It's precisely the move that gives anti-black accumulation its visceral, affective reality. Their rhetoric of politics of survival and maintaining the ability to find another day simply ensures time never passes and only accumulates. At James. And 15, resilience. It must be performed explicitly, legibly, spectacularly. Resilience is overcoming but not accomplished in a visible, consumable manner. A type of effectively risk productive only to the extent in which the public performances it must be visible. The generationalized the resilience is invisible. To look to think resilience in terms of the look I overcame imperative is it means of crafting and race gender identities and distributing white patriarchal privilege. Upgrade on the looking is a look at Negro exclamation. Look at Negro racialized as objectified by the white supremacist gaze and resilience discourse objectification isn't an end but a means opposed by the damage through which the white male gaze and the prerequisite for subjectivity, agency, mutual recognition being looked at as an impediment but a resource of resilience discourse that turns objectification means subjectification and spectator means the performance individual overcoming conditions of resilience. Feminine subject hailed the resilience of some African American women contrasted to the continued fragility of other African American women reinforces the class distinction among blacks. Our women are already liberated, reveling in objectification into overcoming and compounding, looking so that one can profit from others. Resilience, treating their overcoming as one's own overcoming. Neoliberalism's aesthetic and another type of cinematic medium. Resilience discourse. The alternative is voting negative is a withdrawal from the instrumental game of column responses and aesthetic undercommons of redaction, opacity, and fugitive resonance. Redaction is not an opposition to surveillance in the university state logistical system, but instead is an aesthetic embodiment of indecision, a critical strategy of resistance that cannot be captured on the wiretap because it's always on the tip of the tongue. That's Moten. And 18, criminality is a thing realizing the crimes, the relation between ontology over history, the historical and ontological relation between the blackness and radicalism can be maximized and maximized and understands radicalism. It can be any kind of outrooted ontological relation between the blackness and radicalism and blackness can be archival performances disrupted and makes space operating before the modernization and regress that constantly engendering the ordinary and everyday economy is impossible. And domesticity requires an attempt to attune oneself to the language outside of women, that common law outlaw to investigate and inhabit the mode of interiority, political aesthetic assertion, criminality. That is the law of the outside everyday laboring in the crowd, the everyday people enforces the impossible domestic to those who labor in labor in and out of the house, a constitutive economy. Yet she remains irreducibly outside of the economy of the house and outside of the law of protection of which the laws of assault criminality is constitutive force in relation to the house and the family, the city, the law, the statute. Status of the outlaw and that the deconstructive force and the reconstructive danger criminality is essential to historical and outlaw the impossible domestic is before the law not to be subject to it because it's not under its protection. She is the law to restore the vessel before the law of citizenship is denied to the thing that denies the citizenship. The lawless freedom of the improvisation is about stealing in and singing out of which they emerges another voluntary organization improvising through the house and the field eruption into the arbor, the aesthetics of criminality that is inseparable from the law of the movement that outside the house and the structures that make it possible to enter the impossible home without this national homelessness by leaving this radical absence of absenting home and originating theory already preserves the house and is dismantled so radically that not only is it trouble or making impossible, but also fundamentally disfigures, refigures, and reconfigures ownership of the tools we enact to deconstruct and only moves into relation to reconstruction. The improvisation begins at the eruptive reconstruction of the fugitive sound to run, then enacts a fundamental dispossession of ownership as such as owning is itself to disown the preservation of all totality criminality. Being against the law brings us to develop our understanding of a blackness as a political, economic, and sexual aesthetic formation is expropriated. The law becomes a discourse to which we turn in order to get the essence of what the very law means, and both the control and the slander criminal can be understood as a resistant argumentation of the proper, not as a violation of criminal law, but as a capacity to transgress the law, such as the challenge of mystical authority with a kind of improvisational rupture. The case debate, abolition movements and practices aim to dismantle a structure of white supremacy while preserving anti-blackness as a foundation, animating the new social structures arising from the Matic. And 15, the calls for legal reform just in the failure to address the possessive investment of liberty evidence in the abolition movement that requires an analysis of crime that links to the social structures opposed to individual pathology without a radical position vis-a-vis expanding prison system architecture, surveillance, and corporatization of person culture. The racist and totalitarian implications continue to claim ever-increasing numbers of people of color and the danger of abolition movement that tend to the dismantling structure of white supremacy without grappling the anti-blackness of correlated police and vigilante killings about our black people are now occur. White Americans are comfortable with punitive policing when they imagine that the people being policed are put in prison. Our black long shadow of idea of black criminals inspires higher anxiety. A long shadow of anti-blackness that must be confronted. Social movement efforts to dismantle white supremacist institutions will fail. In lieu of this, there's an interpolation to said, how will you engage knowledge presented in the 1AC? Will you accept the project total visibility, rendering legible emancipation but never freedom, or will you reject the impulse to reclaim what was already lost and redact that's lipid? And 5, there's an archive that burns because the archive engenders an irreducible distance regardless of the proximity. The archive that burns is all removes always, it burns both internally and externally and go by the flames, but also outside in the position of fervor on the inside, the political, the public interiority, secret exteriority. All archives are destined to do. The archive burns. It's constituted in the archive burning by the leaving the traces and cinders of remnants by which each archive is in the end of the continuity. This is all the archives are. The realize that destruction preserve other traces of destruction. Those traces or ruins of the archives are neither internal or external. So the archive neither is outside of it. The archive is the limit, and the end of the limit of the interiority and security. The archive burns simultaneously from the outside in and from the inside out. The origin of the destruction comes from within and without. Another archive, a secret archive. The archive of secrets. That very aspect of the archive, a secret that precedes the archive and serves a condition of possibility, and impossibility reality is defined as a secret. And another archive is essential without being any less foreign to the archive that it replaces this. And another archive takes place in the room that the archive is even out of its room. The archive is indivisible in the front of the archive tour, but also inside it. This stands always before the law. In the archive, the law of the archive is defined by 220 the law that calls for the secret in order to banish it in the but also always to inhabit it. The atomic law of indivisibility. Your investments in the captive body are pornotroping if you can't bring shit to the table. That's king. And 19. The side of the black bodies in pain make feeling the objects for the study of the injury of the violence of the period, the anti-racist intent of white non-black researcher does not naively assume white non-black scholars interest in blackness as allyship. The corporate university does not appear to scholars for political action or its eradication of anti-black racism. The corporate university trains us to work against our best selves. Humanists of the corporate reality train to intervene upon it to develop impulse to improve the black studies by documenting a record of legacy. White and non-black scholars in the academy acquires more than accountability. The call towards an unbecoming towards chaos approaches blackness in its embodied form and abolish the self that makes through itself through destruction of black bodies. It can undo black people and it can undo and reorganize white and non-black bodies on different terms and expose the ways in which white non-black self renders the black body captive being for whiteness and others that can be undone and remade into relation to blackness.
You good?
Yes.
Okay. So the first Moan and Harney piece of evidence,
Yep.
Is there a way that performance can escape the university?
I don't know what you mean by escape. Can you be more clear about that?
Can it be outside of the university where it's not surveilled?
So I think that's kind of like there's two parts of our critique, obviously, but I think the answer to that question is that you've kind of already made this argument, right? That like both being in and outside is kind of like impossible, right? Like it is all one thing. Everything is sort of entangled in and of itself, which means that is why redaction and being opaque about certain strategies and not focus so much on the logistics and the planning of those things is important, because there is not a world in which Blackness can sort of escape that. Not necessarily that it cannot escape that visibility, but rather understanding that sometimes we have to redact, because that is the only sort of thing that we have to sort of like keep ourselves safe, to keep our performances, etc.
Okay, so what part of the 1AC's planning did you think needed to be redacted?
I'm sorry?
Was there a specific portion of the 1AC that the criticism thinks is not appropriate for the university?
Well, one, you've already exposed your strategy. So for me to identify what I think needs to be redacted would only feed more into the university about what I think is the most successful or the most productive thing that could like overcome the university or whatever. So for me to tell you, oh, I think this needs to be redacted would be counterintuitive to that very thesis.
Okay, sounds good. The second link, the tactical transparency link, says that only a refusal of the aesthetics of planning is bad. And then the first line of the card is just like, we should dwell in planning. What's the distinction between an aesthetics of planning and like planning that Moan and Harney talk about?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part?
What's the difference between the aesthetics of planning that is bad about the AF and like the genuine planning that Moan and Harney talk about?
Well, specifically, we think that the aesthetic of transparency is what redaction embodies, i.e. the refusal to kind of give specific alternatives to embody redaction in this moment is that kind of more dwelling and planning.
So the 1AC is like an analytic to understand the world. Would the critique say that that analytic is also too transparent?
Well, yes. Well, our argument is that the 1AC is transparent because it revolves around the idea of solidifying the 1AC as a project for expanding upon already kind of performing moments of like radical abolition, etc.
I.e. it solidifies itself as the best heuristic to understand the world, which we think is counterintuitive, because it would even go against probably the AF's idea that like everyone has a different sort of militant preservation, etc.
And the last question is, what is the Undercommons analytic to understand criminal justice reform? Is there one?
Are you just asking about what the alternative is?
Or how does it understand criminal justice reform?
That's redacted.
Okay, so for some of you, the argument that Kansas BD is making might ring a bell because it's similar to something that they said in the finals of CETA from 2 seasons ago. Obviously, there was no CETA this past year, so they were in the CETA finals a couple years ago, and that was the first time I remember them making this argument. So that's part of why I was so excited to see it deployed up close and in person, and I'm looking forward to see how it progresses. But before we move on, I just wanted to talk to Daniel briefly because he's had some proximate experiences with the race war app. So I was just wondering what last year, when you were thinking about prepping and strategizing into this app, what did you find difficult to do? Because that's something that I think a lot of people may have struggled with last year. And I think that affirmatives like this could become increasingly popular, especially on the criminal justice reform topic.
Yeah, so especially for apps like the race war, and I guess especially how Coppell debated it, is that it could mean a lot of different things. And by the 2AC, what you thought what the 1AC was could be completely different, and that could also change by the 2AR. So in terms of prepping, it was hard to find something to hold them to. And so that meant maybe looking through the cards, finding specific quotes so that you can hold them down to something, or it means that thinking about what their 2AC answers are or what their 2AR could be and building backwards from that. So if you know, for example, that they'll go for something about, that they'll go for something about like relationality, they go for something about individuation as an answer to the permutation. And so you want to be able to have those answers built into the 1NC so that you don't have to waste 2NC time doing that as well.
Okay, so that makes sense. I think building in kind of safety valves in the 1NC for things that you know will be tricks is important, because the 2AC, for especially the teams who are succeeding at a high level, will always have something new to throw at you. So making sure that you're covering up the stuff that you know is going to happen seems important, just so that you could have depth later in the debate. Okay, so the other question I was going to ask is, you were 2A last year. For some of the year you read a critical app, for some of the year you read a more kind of policy app with some key advantages. I was wondering, when debating against 1NCs like this that are pretty new and innovative, I mean, we're not just dealing with a CAP-K or an argument that everyone has seen a bunch of times, but instead something you've maybe had fewer practice debates on. And then the second thing in this 1NC is that a lot of it seems very broad and conceptual. The links, we heard a little bit in cross-ex about what the specific links were, but I think that part of why 1NCs like this are strategic is they're crafted to be difficult to pin down. So when you're giving a 2AC against a position that you're finding trouble with in terms of quite understanding the direction it's going to go, what strategies did you use to make sure you covered your bases in the 2AC and had something to work off of for the rebuttals?
Yeah, so instead of focusing on like, finding a name for the K and then looking at 2AC blocks for AT cap or AT security or whatever, it's to look at the links specifically and think about them as almost separate critiques, because by the 2NC could go for a link almost by itself. And so if you undercover any of the links, then it's game over. So especially for something that you don't know the sort of theory or the broader body of things, or it could be too many things, I would look at the specific links. And so finding answers and carded answers for those things and having a two-area strategy for almost every different link really helped in sort of preparing for the 2AC, because that meant that no matter what the 2NC did, we'd have some way to get out of it in the 1AR, and we'd always have the AF to weigh against it anyways. And so prioritizing the link debate was probably like the most important thing that had a lot of success last year.
Yeah, and I think it changes based on the type of debate. I think if you're reading an AF with a big hegemony advantage or something, then the link debate might already be gone after the 1NC. But in these kind of complicated K-on-K debates, I think that the opposite is true, and the links are something that really need to be focused on, and examples, I think, are something that can be very helpful. Yeah, so Shreyas, are you ready for the 2AC?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, awesome. All right, I'm gonna kind of mute and then we can go do the 2AC.
Let me know when everyone is good. Yeah. All right, cool. Vote affirmative for a policy of military preservation that traces the logistical code of criminal justice reform and revitalizes sociality as a new blockage that stops the process of individuation to enjoy the ongoing race wars, a mode of mutual indebtedness against white institutional violence, similar to the field behold or South Asian party states, but oriented against the logistics of the race wars here and happening at the alt-right Ferguson extrajudicial killings, anti-black debate practices like black computers, getting the cops called the nature of round robin, striking of black judges, the role of the judges to think through a pedagogy of abolition is a heuristic to understand how incarceration is not confined to the prison industrial complex, but infiltrated our social relations, and understanding that military preservation and sociality revitalizes energy that can be directed against carcerality. The line by line, the first evidence of cardinalized legal reform, which is definitely not as bad. Second, we aren't broadly abolition, but rather an understanding of how carcerality is not only out there, but also in here insofar as it infiltrates our social relations. The interpolation Desai is not necessarily, the interpolation Desai doesn't really link to the act. We don't dictate how military preservation ought to look like or how people ought to relate to one another. That itself is opaque, which probably proves that the alternative is not mutually exclusive with the affirmative. But total invisibility is bad insofar as analytics, which will be impacted on the king piece of evidence. The card says that non-black people need to understand how their desires interact with not only anti-blackness but the black body itself. The all probably links more to this because we create an analytic that forces them to center these particular politics, reduction as non-black people to come up with their own analytic, which probably risks reproducing violence. Okay. This is a critique of the status quo. They haven't contested the solvency mechanism of the act. We largely agree the macro system of logistics determines the trajectory of all politics because it saturates not only the world, but how we come to understand it. But there is a massive distinction between the macro level of logistics and how we create blockages within it at the micro level. The world will always continue to upgrade policing techniques because it needs to do so in order to function and sustain the race war. But that is not mutually exclusive with micro modes of military preservation, where the analytic of haptic care is used to confuse the system of logistics because hapticalities perform differently. First, the counter-hegemonic links, the performance of logistics is inevitable, and so is the university. But don't mistake the 1AC for an articulation of a tactic within the university. Our argument is that the university, just like logistics, is a smooth-flowing, functioning system, but it's not perfect. As ubiquitous as the system is, it's always vulnerable to the system, which neurofirings that were never supposed to happen, and movement that cannot be expropriated. The 1AC is not a tactic, but an analytic of sociality, one that refuses to dictate what haptic care looks like, but understands that it's molten potential to produce a crack within the system. As Butler reminds, his technical form emerges in a dialectics of domination and struggle. The code works up, and we work the code. That's Butler in 17. The cognitive linguistic have undergone colonial appropriations of the less violation of the slave treaties, encroachment of linguistic comments with level technical saturation parts of the political has been lost. What can political meaning what character by algorithmic governance of platform sovereignty, this appropriation cognitive linguistic by capital reduces discursive productions to the machine inequity, inequality, sediment into machines, population, injustice to produce and reproduce a planetary culture founded upon race and machines. But the understanding the original racial societies considered the positive of the program as a series of accumulation strategies operating through everyday consciousness, transparent, quantifiable, computable, however, some thinking matching kind of such close only one direction, form emerges domination, struggle from the ways the outpress, the press like domination, persistently racialization, part of parcel of corporeal inscription, the system we work to go down both the micro and the macro levels of structural organization, just like no existing political discourse and emergent rising current costs that itself are fully circumscribed by the law, and himself have become operates fully functional by individual information works like transforms and as nearly all mental social and neural processes. Also, submitting them to a drop reaching financialization of everyday life for everyone is forcing continuous output information and management volatility and risk. We are doing the overcutting of bodies and practices, social, political, and strategies and accumulation, plugs and plasticity are always on head in the state of of capital. Permutation, do both. Redaction is an example of the undercommon affectivity that emotion preservation encompasses. It's the in-self-sufficiency of the affirmative that acts as a form of logistical sabotage. The micro levels in which we theorize the undoing of structures of power, not only out there, but in here, as logistics becomes weaponized in debate. That's Milton and Hardy 15. When we move, we assemble and disassemble and new and that's our undercommon affectivity. We make actions, but the line undoing and the undoing of every single part to move wrong or not to move sabotage. It is an attack on the assembly line is the version of logical capitalism. We are violently invited to exercise the right to individuality. Those who want, and for those who keep moving wrong, they like being incompleting one another, said to be sketchy. They're uncoordinated, they're in-self-sufficient, it is our incompleteness and classes towards one another. The more we think of ourselves as finished, whole, and native, the more we can have love and be loved. Our love is the undercommon self-defense, we can complete our defense, we love that we are complete, only completing completion. Work with the would have that we do my working as we do. Mind dying. This debate is not solely a question of analytics, but what politics we decide to adapt in the face of said analytics. Violence is not merely in a vacuum, but a response to the condition of society itself. Even if they win that their analytic is accurate, the solvency mechanism of the efforts militant preservation trains legitimacy to what creates the violence in the first place because it refuses to invest within an attorney. And Mo in 17, imagine tradition of black social life on police. We know if they're in here, we know that we cannot happens all the time. Radical homelessness, the kinetic conditionalities, reducible queerness is the essence of black and modern needs. Constitution, transatlantic slave, transatlantic of the colonialism and capitalism emerges in and with the state of the socio-ecological necessity of sacred power of love, which is given as a defiance to the state and the state of the capacity to make and break laws. It can't live with us and it can't live without us. As its violence is a reaction to that condition. It is something other than a war against its own condition, which finds us with so much tendency for interaction for us. And in various capitalist and colonial state of wars, brutality, militarizations, regulated and modernity are continually upgraded and revised, but they are not new. The state of the wars are reacting to regulated, capitalizing upon innovation for survival of the law. But there's a which when we examine our appeals, so we need to stop worrying so much about how it kills, regulates, and accumulates. Us worry more about how we kill, deregulate, and disperse. We have to love and revert our survival, which is a resistance. The tactical transparency link. The act is not a form of tactical transparency, but rather being indebted to one another, which creates the conditions for society. It's not an aesthetics of logistics, but rather reframing how we understand aesthetics itself, separate of the desire for credit. Modern horny tendi that within the credit of black and the queer, the criminal, the credit. It means the privatization and debt is means the socialization. So long as that equity repair with my language response to the home of the person, the government, the only university that can only feel credit is the only means of debt. It was about the education of public research to gather information on it, to calculate they want to save it, they want to break its constitution and store for 5 months and they think that is a real crisis for that we feel we felt in the way that someone saves the best person just for you, and then it's gone given as that you're in debt, but you can't give credit because they won't hold it, but the student has bad attitudes. That is, the student is not intent to pay the resiliency link. It's definitely not us. It's about living to fight another day within the map of logistics, but rather how the description of the race war allows us to understand how we can create moments of sociality within it. Logistical capitalism makes co-option inevitable, but community building can create a way to all build alternative worlds and fight back. This came to as a team. I think of circumventing lessons opposition is ability to reinvest away from neoliberal resilience. Yes, black colleagues approach for this capital, but it is also to choose yourself to account for the ways in which aesthetic strategies or co-optation on an alternative world building that invalidate one another, doing things that make you feel like that's a way of coping with systemic trauma. Those responsible pathologize because they don't adequately marketize trauma for MRWAs as capital. If resiliency is political work of fighting back, we think of subcultural community building work of self and other care that generates meaning in other registers. In real life, you need both fighting back and the care that builds alternative worlds. Even if we are, it's good. It stops individuation. It's smaller. And 17, it has been to this resiliency is neoliberal and then maintaining the status quo, maintaining this way that students should learn to get on with it. I reframe resilience to argue that resilience is a neutral concept which has been added to co-opting neoliberalism, the ability to bounce back without ideological backing, the fact that we live in a neoliberal environment and that we bounce back within it. Does not mean that we bounce back to reclaim our place in the neoliberal capital. We have no choice but to bounce back. We should see resilience as resistance building, resilience creating community networks against the individualizing tendencies appeal. This appeals to be very active and reshaping rather than passive acceptance. There's an individuation decide to the alternative, right? Redaction becomes co-opted by logistics because it gives into the process of individuation, even if it is able to render itself opaque to the system of logistics within the university's form. It's transparent to the same system because how redaction becomes understood. Those that seek to adopt it are invited to exercise their right to individuate, which tears us apart and intensifies racial battle fatigue. and makes the case that it's to the alternative because it makes it impossible to revitalize social energy, which can only be done through being indebted to one another rather than individuating politics. There's also an entanglement that non-Black academics and debaters must take seriously the way their desires interact with Black scholarship, which can only be done through descriptive accounts. Redaction's inability to account for a direction in which our politics flows creates a gap that is filled by whiteness. Rather than forcing non-Black subjects to answer the two questions of their entanglement and analytic, it leads to a politics of deflection that creates double agents, similar to how the FBI infiltrated the BPP to promote them. Only the app's analytic offers an accountability mechanism for how non-Black subjects can trace their social relations and desires in relation to Blackness. Anything else?
You're good.
I'm good for cross-ex. I think you're muted.
Would have been correct. Okay, I guess I want to start off talking about what you all think indebtedness is, or what does that mean to be indebted to one another? I want to start there.
I think being indebted to one another means that when we think of politics or what we sort of want to get done, it's not necessarily focusing on that telos, but rather how we are sort of not necessarily fighting for that telos, but fighting for ourselves.
Interesting. Okay, so that leads me then to my next question. Why is it a question of we, or how does the affirmative come to understand who we is? Because the AF has already started from a point that we are all indebted to one another. Who is we?
I think we is like, that's sort of a weird question because
it's really
our argument is that logistics.
Niggas aren't always quite understood, or our experiences aren't always the same as other people. Those things operate on different sort of scales and sort of gradients.
Yeah.
So I want to know how we come to that kind of understanding of we.
Well, I think that like that understanding of we doesn't necessarily need to be homogenous. I mean, I don't think that the app would disagree that there's different scales, i.e. different people experience violence differently. But our argument is that because of sort of the conditions that logistics produces, these experiences are incomplete to an extent. And in those moments of incompleteness in which we find indebtedness, which is what I think the Monin-Harney piece of evidence says in the 2AC.
Interesting. So explain to me then, if it is true then that the AF sees who we is as not necessarily a sort of homogenous thing, how is it, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to understand how then it is the best heuristic for kind of militant preservation if that looks differently. Like, what does that mean for the AF to just be able to like affirm everyone's form of militant preservation?
So
Well,
I
don't think.
Wait, one sec, Shreyas. I think that like
Yeah.
part of militant preservation is that it is not the same for everyone, i.e. sociality is used and the energy is used for different means. So yes, there might be different textures of violence, but the app is
I understand that because you all really love to use this example about like Black debaters getting the cops called on them, which is not necessarily something I think that you two have, maybe you've got the cops called on you, but I don't think that you're Black kids. Am I incorrect about that? So like, I'm confused as to how we can just generally affirm militant preservation when maybe my militant preservation might be at the unsafety of you or anyone around you, or how your self-preservation could be at my like unsafety. So I'm just like trying to,
I think
how the affirmative can just win that you affirm militant preservation.
Well, I think like the sort of problem with that question I have is like the characterization of militant preservation as self-preservation. I think a large component of militant preservation itself is understanding the.
Back to my initial question, which is how do we come to an understanding of we? Because if we is not homogenous, then that means that not all of those needs or how we preserve ourselves will ever be the same, which means that they will always be in tension. Can he? Mini prop?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so during prep, I wanted to talk about something I liked from the 2AC and also from CrossX. So I think that something that this 2AC does particularly well from a form perspective is acknowledging that a large parts of the affirmative and negatives argument are not super mutually exclusive and that there are some points of agreement. I also think that it does a good job of acknowledging kind of the best version of the opponent's argument. So I think towards the beginning, Shreyas uses this format of we are in agreement about X, and then explain why that's an agreement, and then say, but a key difference is. And I think that maintaining that kind of structure, particularly in a King on K debate, can be helpful for judges, because I think that one of the things that debaters don't realize is just how difficult judging is, especially when things are very dense and complicated. A lot of times when I'm judging a debate that follows this format, it's very difficult for me to know what exactly in the debate is important and what I should care about. And if the 2AC, which is the affirmative's last chance to make offensive arguments, is able to dictate what the judge is thinking in their mind for the next hour is important about the debate and what question they're deciding the debate on, that can be an incredibly powerful tool to getting the judge to decide in your favor. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, I think in cross-ex, this is a really good example of both Shreyas's and Azja's cross-ex style that I've seen. So if you notice, Azja kind of sticks to the same question for almost 3 minutes about this question of what does we mean in the context of dealing with things like militant preservation, sociality, and asks it in several different ways, and always kind of returns to that same theme. So clearly, that's kind of demonstrating, I think, a lot of what the 1NR is likely to be about. And I think that it also replicates Azja's style, which is very cards all out on the table. This is my argument. I'm right about it. You're wrong about it. Sorry. And I think that the answers replicate Coppell's style, which is very much, we don't want to link to what you're trying to link us to, and we're going to keep saying the same thing that is going to be impossible for you to spin a link to over and over. And I think that the frustration that that caused is kind of right in line with what their tactic is. And so I think that was a clash of two very different cross-ex styles. One that's kind of like, we're going to hide all of our cards and reveal them in the 2AR, and one that is very much style that is, we're right about one central point and we don't care what you think, because we know we're going to win it at the end of the day, and we're not trying to hide anything. And I think both are super successful tactics, but I think that crafting your personality as a debater is something that's super important, especially in the era of Zoom debate. And at the UTNIF, it's something that we're going to talk about a lot, because something a lot of us are concerned about was establishing ethos in an online platform. And I think that cross-examination, particularly with Azja, but also I think Shreyas did a good job, was establishing a very clear ethos. And I think that you can kind of feel that energy through Zoom in a way that before this debate, I didn't even know would be possible. So I think that that's a good sign for going forward. Daniel, something I wanted to just ask you about is an argument that has been made a bunch the last couple of years and is a little bit new to me, but it's something we experimented with last year and a lot of teams have been talking about, is this idea of accountability mechanisms. So for at least 10 years, I've been watching and participating in debates about movements, how movements organize, what tactics is used, what strategy they should use. Something that's relatively new is discussing accountability mechanisms to make sure that those movements don't do violence to people or exclude people, kick them out, do things that are problematic. And that was a core component of the 2AC that I think will end up mattering later in the debate, particularly in relation to this entanglement question that was the focus of cross-ex. So I was wondering, what was your experience last year in debating that specific topic in relation to movements arguments, and how would you advise debaters to prepare for that argument?
Yeah, so especially early in the year, when we haven't thought nearly as much as we did towards the end of the year about these things, usually if the question wasn't answered by the 2AC on things like the restorative versus preventative justice, by the 1AR, it's like,
restorative versus what?
Preventative justice,
okay, yeah.
In terms of accountability mechanisms. Usually by the 1AR, it seems like you're trying to make up for something that wasn't there. And so most judges aren't persuaded by that. And so a lot of what needs to be done in terms of these sorts of debates is that they need to be started earlier on. So I guess the biggest example and the best example I can think about, the roles are flipped. So we would go for the CAPK, and in the 1NC, we would read like 2 to 3 cards about the nature of why racial resistance and forefronting Black and Indigenous struggles at the core of our movement was necessary in the 1NC. So that way, if the 2AC or so I guess the roles weren't flipped, but so when the 2AC goes for those like accountability mechanism stuff, so they ask about it during 1NC cross-ex, we would have a lot of evidence and like explicit, robust systems about how those accountability mechanisms are in place. So at least perceptually, the judge doesn't think that, you know, you're just trying to make up something that wasn't there, because it was there in the 1NC. And so starting it early, I think, is the best strategy towards answering these arguments.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that a lot of critical thinking and iterative testing that comes from debates like this one about that question is particularly cogent for everyday life now. I think that a lot of people are spending much of their time thinking about resistance and thinking about accountability for those movements is a super important thing. And my hope is that there will be a way to translate this knowledge into a portable skill that is helpful for everyday life and everyday thinking about those broader questions. Yeah. So Kenny, are you good to go? Okay, awesome. So we'll do the 2NC, brought to you by just graduated from Kansas. Very excited to see what you accomplish in grad school. I'm sure it'll be incredible. I'm definitely looking forward to it. All right, ready to go.
Me, so that's fine. I'm over it.
Yeah, we'll call this debate to do without BD bringing energy to.
Can everyone hear me? Pretty well.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. The order is the critique. There is an overview, and you can definitely flow it on a different page if you would like.
I hate us.
Can I have the
I don't like that people are seeing two different views of this because they're all
It's not cool. It's in 9 minutes, right? Cool. Everyone good? The 1AC adopts an aesthetic of transparency, the call for military preservation that involves the forced participatory roles of the 1AC's abolition pedagogy. The only response they have for debate is the site of knowledge production, and the race war is to accumulate evidence to expose for you and the judge and the audience the unseen truth within the historical record of misrecognitions of blackness as a radical site for recognition and resiliency, the particular set of performance expectations that the race war indicts is most effective through poetic and reinterventional anti-black tropes, and it exposes the conspiracy, the powerful, intentional on and intentional blank spaces within social imaginary conventional unique modes of inquiry. The affirmative aesthetics failed in face of authority and trustworthiness. Imagine audience within the debate to instrumental sense of accumulating the truth, so negative to reject the aesthetic of transparency, in which this ultimately committed to the same project of logistical recognition that it criticizes this simply, left arguing that this particular instance of white humanism failed to make itself absolute transparency as policy can only be predicated on various self-reporting to the appropriate higher authority. There's two. On the impact level, there's two arguments. The first is reproductive captivity. Anti-blackness is about eradicating anti-blackness, but instead forcing blackness to signify symbolically. James says that blackness is rendered fungible through its facilitation of the continuous accumulation of violence. The second argument is the neoliberal biopolitics. Their politics creates black resilience, which is part and parcel of the neoliberal market of governance, in which the goal is not eliminating insecurity, but instead facilitating creative destruction and never-ending opportunity for profit, generating logistical innovations. The AF technique simply facilitates precision and industrial complex demand for new surveillance technologies that can thwart black anti-surveillance. Now the AF facilitates the cycle of anti-blackness by creating a spectacle of surveillance and militant preservation in which blackness is accumulated over and over again in a game of cat and mouse between the prison industrial policing and black resistance technologies. The affirmative does not enable fugitivity. They simply rationalize society's effective entity by giving blackness blackness of writing starts to facilitate the drama. Put another way, if Batman's refusal to kill the Joker isn't about a moral code, but it's more about enabling the drama of capture and escape. Capture and escape. There's just a couple framing arguments at the top. They say that the redaction is a double turn. They have conceded that we are linked to not only the reading of the act within the context of the debate, not their theories. You should revise and resubmit their understanding of the theories of abolition pedagogy, or does not, or is a double turn with the presentation of the act within the debate, because it reconceptualizes and certifies the one they see as a single idea project. The second argument they have, so you should frame this debate. So on the framing level, you should frame this debate. It's not about competing methods, but more about how research practice within logics transparency. Any risk that we're going to dissat, you should default to the revise and resubmit modes. Alternative solvency is the best way for black radical subject formation. The one, it takes out solvency for the act. Any risk we don't have offense debate should supercharge our claims about presumption in the act not doing anything in the first place. Second, and it magnifies the site for interpolation, the commodification of violence. The second argument is that it creates complicit validation. Presenting transparent logic is dangerous, especially when they give you no way as a judge of evaluating absolucy through the balance. This validation, this validation seeks to allow minimal engagement with their theorizations of relationality, only proving their epistemology is flawed by the way they integrate knowledge into the debate community as a continual cultural obsession of truth, as a vote act because our theory, not the link debate proper. There's two links at the top. First is a counter-hegemonic logistics. The impact is black capture back into the neoliberal university. The logic of resilient survival aims to create concrete transparency. This isn't through the resolutional topic. The idea of militancy related to the relies on a performative affect within debate, i.e. the judge is given the power of wielding when and where and how pedagogy abolition happens, where does the act take place. Remember this when they claim we have no alternative link specific to the performance in the act and how it gets reconceptualized. The second link is tactical transparency. The impact is the facilitation of anti-black surveillance, advocating for militancy and pedagogy of abolition through transparent means obscures any undercommon potential of the one he had and militant preservation through transparency. It means hyper-visible black people use as hidden shields in the fight against oppression. That's the role playing the rest. That's important because they conceded that their own Harnian evidence is a double term, because as per the reading of Harnian 1, because redaction is not only aesthetics of transparency that does not reproduce in self-sufficiency, but we've already in fact turned the idea of it just self-sufficiency, because it only recreates resilient modes of survival tactics that thwart any forms of mobilization that get co-opted. This is important because it means that surveillance ramps up specifically on the ground while debaters sit and read the race war ass on. This is important because it means that there are hyper-visible moments in which black people are re-put on the line to make anti-black violence more rampant than the alternative to big proper. That means each one of these links is a reason why redaction solved. Not only does redaction embody the suspension of decision that accumulates and renders blackness fungible in the spheres of transparency, redaction doesn't render or seek to repair the relationality of anti-black violence, but instead withdraw to disrupt the ways in which violence is described to subject formations through radical positions. This is important because studying negative redact is an aesthetic withdrawal of redaction, creates a performative expectation of secrecy and opacity. There are two disads we've already internally turned them. The first, the individual dissad is impact turned by the extension of the James 15 evidence from above, because they recreate forms of racial capitalism that expand through neoliberal markets and insecurities. The second, the entanglement dissad, the entanglement dissad is entered above with on the link level, because their understanding of entanglement only is conceptualized through superficial ways. One NC process is great on this. Two EC process is great on this idea of a we relationality in the debate. In debate, they only recreate new forms of violent attachments within that create superficial modes of solidarity. The alternative instead withdraws that trust and assumes the performance is being watched and surveilled by the audience for signs of dispassion, rather than seeking to perform a clear and instrumental role for the higher social authority. The alternative treats the passing itself as instrumentally valuable. That proves the goal, which is simply evading detection. Another argument is that on the level of how the app is operating, I think it's important to kind of recognize that not only does the app kind of take a step further to kind of move away from the idea of entanglement in its understanding of the abolition pedagogy, but the fact that the app in itself only can exist within the debate space recreates forms of logistical planning that or logistical kind of a policy that they kind of criticize because of the ways in which each round is about kind of spreading not only the idea of the app as the abolition pedagogy, but as the best heuristic that gives the judge only the option to either ask for the good heuristic to understand abolition pedagogy or somehow delegitimize movements that are happening in the SQO. Our argument is not that the SQO, or our argument is not that your app creates uniqueness for the SQO, but instead the uniqueness of reading the app in the 1AC recreates those more anti-black forms of surveillance. Yeah. Cool. I'm good for process.
You good?
Yeah, actually.
Okay, cool. One of the last arguments you made was that entanglement results in superficial coalitions. How do you know the difference between a superficial coalition and a genuine one?
Well, I think that's kind of what redaction kind of embodies, right? It's like you don't really know, but when the time comes, you will, right?
Okay. And why is that not true then of the AF and how we come together in moments of militant preservation?
Posited itself as a heuristic to allow those moments to be expressed in a way that creates new moments of pedagogy that emerge from it. Our argument is that is the kind of that in itself is a double turn with the idea of entanglement because it tries to create a central focal point to kind of branch out of.
Okay. Another argument that was made was that the AF is hyper-visualized in a space of debate. Would the alternative say that there are spaces either in debate, outside of debate, that aren't then hyper-visualized?
Well, yes, because our argument is not that Black people should not, or there is a way for Blackness and Black people not to be hyper-visible, but instead the ways in which hyper-visibility is wielded in spaces where logics, where a transparent kind of logics kind of overdetermine Black kind of Black kind of sociality is important, right? I think debate is one of those spaces because yes, while the AF says that debate operates in ways that racial violence is kind of experienced, those very moments of the race war happen to Black debaters every day, but there's no kind of moment of, well, we're all here, that the AF kind of posits.
Okay, so I'm wondering how that argument of saying that there are spaces and tactics that we can take that are not hyper-visualized is in tension with the 1NC argument that's like logistics is always all around us.
Well, because our argument is that the idea of logistics always being around us re-solidifies a transparent logic of how those logistics are used within spaces like debate. Our argument is not that your understanding of logistics is bad, but that you recreate a new kind of insidious and parasitic attachment to a radical understanding of logistics that only recreates the same fungibility.
Okay, and then the resiliency argument at the top, what part of the AF is a sort of resilient narrative?
Well, the idea that the reading of the AF creates a moment of kind of moment of hapticality ignores that those kind of moments get reproduced in kind of neoliberal ways instead of actually allowing for like kind of progress and mobilization for actual kind of groundwork.
Then why does redaction and those moments of care that it produces not get also trapped in the same neoliberal system?
Because it's redacted.
But you said when the time comes, we would know what it is. So why wouldn't the university also know?
I'm sorry?
You said when the time comes, we will know what it is. So why wouldn't when the time comes, the university also know?
Because it's redacted. It's like you wouldn't know what that meant if it's redacted. I guess it's my response to that.
Okay, so I'm sure Azja's probably already ready to give a 1R, but just one quick thing, because Daniel mentioned to me that there was something further he wanted to talk about cross-sects of the 2ACs. So we'll talk about the 2NC after the 1R, but I just want to know what that was that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, so particularly like right after the 1AC, in terms of prepping for these apps, I was like, we don't know what the 2AC will be. And I think the cross-sects of the 2AC does a very, very good job about gaining links, because a lot of the pushes were on like what is the we, like how is the AF like a specific tactic, or is the AF like an ethos? And in that sense, this is very much in reference to, I think, the first and the second links about survival politics versus like a rubric for resistance. And so in that cross-ex, Coppell does their like, oh, not us thing, which I guess was effective, but I thought that, at least to me, it seemed from a position of an outsider that Coppell was sort of on the back foot in terms of defining what they are, which gives the 2NC especially more leeway on the link debate, because it means that they can contextualize the links to what they think will be, and also makes the judge more receptive to changes in the link explanation by the 2NR, because the AF has not fully solidified their position by the 2AC or the 1AR. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, David, was about the framework debate. In terms of like the you link, you lose framework, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common trend in negative framework arguments, and is one that is being discussed a lot, that the problem with certain debates is that it results in a you link, you lose framing. I think that that's probably necessary, though, at least in the 2NC. I think that when it's so difficult to establish a clear link argument, sometimes it takes so much effort to hit the condition of establishing a link that if you have to do more beyond that to establish a win condition, then it can be almost impossible for the negative, because the affirmative gets to speak last, right? And so I think that that's the strategic reason behind the development of those kind of framework arguments for the negative, particularly in debates like this one. I think the combination of that framework argument with Azja's cross-ex could end up resulting in something successful in the 2NR, and some pretty helpful packaging. Although again, I do think that Coppell did a very good job dealing with what was a very difficult set of cross-ex questions. So I think both teams played hard. All right, so we're ready for the 1NR now.
Can you hear me? I don't think I'm muted. Okay, great. Sorry. It's gonna be the perm first, and then I will go to case. Yikes. Okay, can I have that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, didn't want to do that. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, talking to myself. Do that a lot. Contrary to popular belief, being the 1N is hard, okay? You have me on record saying that, so just letting everyone know. All right, everyone good? Yeah. Cool. You should refuse to call to pick and choose between different niggas, fabulations, and strategies for resistance. No justification for the permutation. Several reasons. All the 2NC link analysis are terminal dissets to the affirmative. This is a method B method debate, and a permutation will be an eraser of the labor put into the strategy of the 1NC. You presented the strategies that catch all for niggas relationality, means that you should be able to defend what it is at this point, which is the point I'm getting to at the cross-ex of the 2AC about understanding the affirmative as a single heuristic is bad and ineffective. The articulation of the permutation that they do have is a horrible metric for understanding community and strategy development, because it ignores the ways in which Black people can be violent to one another and justifies a unique accumulation of strategies to be deployed and erased at whim, which is exactly the cross-ex point I'm getting at. New articulations of the permutation should be funneled through 2 questions before given any consideration, or rather 3. The first is the permutations of our testing competition, and then puts competition ahead of community payoffs by creating an adversarial model. This trades off with generating effective and consensual means of negotiating violence between both in and out of the Black community, which neither of them are a part of. The second is accountability. The permutation incentivizes the affirmative to shift goalposts or morph after the 1NC that distorts their advocacy by making it inauthentic and immediately suspect, which means that when
when you're listening to the 2AR, you should listen to the ways in which they're describing the permutation, or how the affirmative transforms into a catch-all for understanding how, like, yes, we're all entangled and redaction was always already assumed by the affirmative. No, it wasn't, because you gave away the strategy and you were pretty explicit about what it meant, and using Black people strategically to make the affirmative look appealing in front of different people in this competitive space, which is interesting because the permutation or the whole affirmative is talking about the ways in which the affirmative understands that debate is always being spilled into with anti-Blackness, and that it can't escape the anti-Blackness of the world, which then begs the question, why did you think that the competitive nature of the debate space was not going to affect that sort of anti-Blackness? The third and final thing that you should consider when you're thinking about the permutation articulations is the coal extraction dissent. The performance of the 2AC is an embodiment of an extraction of resources. They have extracted all the value they see in the 1NC, that value being the competitive benefits of stealing the labor of Black women and Black people in particular, which is exactly what I'm talking about when we're talking about the permutation, saying that we always already assumed the sort of permutation or the redaction strategy. Their permutation answers fail because it misunderstands redaction as a practice. We are not necessarily redacting the affirmative, but rather redacting our alternative strategy. Just redacted. That's on period. Case. You should frame the entire case debate through the King evidence. Their answer was superficial and missed the point. King's argument is that even if you think you're bridging some gap between Black people and MBPOC, they're through tacticality and pedagogical shits. It doesn't matter if you have no material strategy to protect Black people from the consequences of their parasiticism through the reading of the 1AC. That's the debaters example about that I'm talking about in the crossing of the 2AC, about the ways in which they are always using this example of Black debaters getting the cops called on them, but they will never fully understand those sort of ramifications of that, regardless of their sort of entanglement theory. The alternative does not link more to this King argument because we understand that redaction is the maintenance of niggas' ability to control how and when they are visible. I exhibit A. There's also a Black Panther dissection in the case. The affirmative is recycling of everything that the Panthers worked on to achieve, while leaving out their most important revelation about the sort of intersection of racial capitalism and anti-Blackness, and the sort of importance of that focus. You should vote negative on presumption. What it is doesn't mean to affirm militant preservation. The 1AC articulation of entanglement can never assume the ways in which some preservation is at the expense of others, even intercommunally, which is again the concept I'm talking about in the cross-ex of the 2AC, because even if they win their argument about the sort of even if they win their argument about how we was never supposed to be homogenous, right? It doesn't matter, because sure, even if you assume that, it ignores that you generally affirming what that sort of militant preservation is messed up, because it means that it can never assume the sort of negative effects that it has on Black people in particular, which is King's argument about how your sort of attempts to be woke or whatever are always going to be parasitic upon Blackness when you don't consider all of those things together. Case proper. You should understand the lipid stuff as an accountability argument. They should be held accountable for the ways in which they make Blackness visible and fungible. This is our link about the object to agent of resistance stuff. The language of the 1AC about militant resistance, if it is used by niggas, or if it is used as a heuristic by Black people, then it gets them messed up or puts them in danger. Because imagine going out into the streets and saying, I'm going to militantly resist police or militantly resist anyone who comes after me as a Black person. Them using that language is not, which puts them in danger, which is why you understanding the affirmative as a good general heuristic for Black people to understand the relation to other things is bad, because it will never assume that there are different gradiences or different ways in which different people can use language. The next is that them hiding behind iconic phrases like the race war and examples like Black people getting the police called upon them when they will never fully understand any of those things amplifies our King's argument about the way that parasiticism operates, which means that you in every instance should reject the permutation, especially if you are not Black, because judging this debate, because it means that there is only a parasitic way to attach to Blackness. The only thing that you have the ability to sort of affirm in this debate is whether or not you think that we are winning the ability for Blackness to sort of pick and choose when it is visible. Even in the screen where you can sort of see me moving my hands, you don't see my face, the emotion that I have, and I have the capacity to control that. Even if I don't always have that capacity, it is still net better to affirm a Black person's ability to say, no, I'm going to redact what I do have, the strategies I have, the things that I like to do, the way that I love, right? If I redact those things, right, it puts me in somewhat of a control of my situation in a always already anti-Black world, which is the sort of interpolation dissent. The last thing is that the interpolation dissent was also mishandled because it misunderstands what we mean by interpolation. You should be held accountable to the ways that Black people are interpreted, etc., which is the stuff I'm doing above, and it means that any sort of dissad that they have to the way that they've made Blackness visible, talking about entanglement and like, oh, like we can generally include everybody, puts them at risk. It means that it just becomes a net benefit to the alternative of redaction. Period. Okay, go.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the neg block so that Shreyas can have some prep time. I thought that 1NR was like fantastic, and I think a clear example of why Kansas has seen so much competitive success at the highest levels in college. I think the thing that I liked best about it was the very clear judge instruction that you often don't see until the 2NR and 2AR is already being set up in the block. So there are several different moments where Azja slows down in the 1NR and says, in the 2AR, you will hear them say this, and then clearly explain why that 2AR explanation will be inadequate for describing their relationship to police being called, or why that example is problematic, or why the militant preservation strategy isn't good. And I think that that's something that debaters often fail to do even in the final rebuttals, but sometimes in those final rebuttals, when you try to make those kinds of arguments, they feel a little bit new and a little bit late. So I think starting really early and having a vision for where the debate's going to end up, thinking 2AR backwards and 2NR backwards, is something that I think we witness executed at a very high level in those speeches.
One thing I wanted to say was that in terms of the block split, giving the 1NR more flexibility and taking the case debate, I thought was pretty important. Like junior year, I was like a block reading machine in the 1NR. And I think it's not only efficient in terms of prep time, giving the 1NR case debate so that they have time to actually make new arguments, but also makes the 2N's life easier because it means that they can read whatever blocks they have. And so it makes prep more efficient and gives more prep for the 2NR. And on the thing you said about in the 1NR making those, if they go for these examples, that's wrong, because a lot of people say the 2NR is a hardest speech because it has to preempt what the 2AR says. And having that start in the 1NR especially makes the 2N's life a lot easier.
Yeah, I didn't mention that, but if you look at the last 15 minutes of a debate using high school times, the negative has 5 minutes to deal with 10 minutes of AF arguments. And so while the neg block is very powerful for trying to overwhelm the 1AR, a lot of times the 2NR both has to respond to the 1AR and predict what the 2AR will say. And I think that the way that the block was able to lay the foundation for much of that work will allow the 2NR to then reference that foundation. And it'll also feel to the judge like, they've been part of this narrative that's being crafted and ultimately ends in the 2NR the entire time. I think that's something that debaters don't think about, is that they assume that just because a judge is paying attention and flowing, that they're with you and tracking arguments in a similar way. But one, judges are distracted easily. I think that'll be perhaps even more true in the era of Zoom debating. And so learning techniques that maintain judge engagement and make it easy for judges to follow along and not be surprised by things, I think will be more important than they ever have been before. And so I think this debate is a good model and place to start for how you might do that, particularly in a debate where both sides are agreeing on a lot of concepts. It can be really challenging to know which details to focus on when you're judging a debate, because in some ways, unless someone tells you what's important, everything feels equally important. And then that ends up with a result of nothing being that important. And then the judge ends up just deciding on some small technical issue, or deciding based on their own knowledge of the literature or their experiences, or they'll think, well, in previous debates like this one, here's how I decided. So I'll just decide based on whoever mirrors that most closely. And I think that the 1NR was an example of how to dictate to the judge what they should believe is important. And doing that work and setting it up early will be more important than ever in the era of online debate.
And also, I think a lot of people, at least in like one-off debates, sometimes don't go to the case debate or spend as much time on it. But I feel like the case debate actually, especially in these debates where the AF and the neg seem to agree on a lot of concepts, the case debate is especially important because that's where you get to interact directly with what the AF said. So in the like in the 2 and C, when you're maybe like answering it on the K, that's through a filtered version of the AF that's given in the 2AC, tailored specifically to the critique. But when you go to the case debate, that's directly the AF always from the 1AC, which means that a lot of the things that might be disconnected from the 1AC and the 2AC are bridged if you actually go to the case debate and answer it there, because it gives them a lot less room to like spin their arguments into whatever they want it to be to answer the critique when you're actually on the critique floor.
Sure, and it also insulates you from the classic K2AR that says we might have messed up some things on the K or on framework or whatever the negatives argument is, but you drop the AF and now you're going to lose because there's this kind of fundamental conceptual thing from the AF. I think something that debaters often fall into the trap of is a lack of evidence and preparation, disincentivizing engagement with the case. I think that because the 1NR has so much built-in prep time, and this is something I think that we can practice extensively at debate camp for those who are struggling with debating KAFs, that built-in 1NR prep allows you to think about specific case responses based on what the 2AC has said. So even if it's challenging to prepare prior to the tournament for KAFs, because the 2AC might change what the 1AC it was, the combination of a very clear cross-ex approach like what we saw and the 1NR taking advantage of the 12 to 15 minutes or so of essentially free prep time that they get to just hammer in on a few case arguments actually can overwhelm even the best 1As, because I think that most people who are reading a critique F are not used to having to robustly defend the claims that they're making. They're used to teams just ignoring it or giving up relatively early. Like maybe you read 1 to 2 generic cards, the 2AC says, not our capitalism or not our Afro-pessimism or not our, insert blank, and then the negative immediately gives up. But I think that that's a mistake. And in fact, you can make the 1AR almost impossible to give because most 1As don't have the kind of practice that is necessary to efficiently deal with specific responses, and you have all of this prep time to come up with arguments. And you don't need cards for them; you just need to kind of logically think about it. But that requires a lot of practice, and I think camp is a place where you can do that practice. Shreyas, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. It's going to be case, then the K. It's going to be, I feel like it might just be best to flow it straight down, but there's going to be like an alt disad, the perm, and the links. Framework is at the bottom. Let me know when. Oh, y'all are good? All right, cool. All right, cool. Vote affirmative for military preservation. Similar to the older Highland people, the act traces the code of logistics and turns inward toward an indebted, incomplete field, creating a neural blockage that halts the process of violent individuation, which saps social energy needed for Black students to enjoy the ongoing system of logistics in the race war. That's limited evidence. 2 examples both in and out of debate prove the capability of resisting logistics. You have a categorical imperative to center abolitionist pedagogy. That's the Rajagopal evidence, line by line on K is the King evidence. The first argument about materialism, no energy, social energy is material. They proceeded on thesis argument about how logistics individuates the subject, which saps social energy in the status quo, which means that Black students don't have the tactics to fight the race war, but the process of haptic care that's provided through military preservation is able to revitalize those forms of social energy, which is a solvency mechanism of the app that goes conceded. Second is that analytics are material insofar as they translate how we're able to effectuate politics in the first place. That we don't understand about politics, we don't understand all forms of violence argument. It's just completely wrong. The app obviously has different theorizations of how people come to understand the violence. Just because we use the word we doesn't mean that we don't understand how different people have different positionalities in relationship to in relationship to those violence. The BPP example is also sort of answered by this because the app is also an understanding of how racial capitalism operates, not solely just things like the physical logistics or sort of homogenous racial theories. Yes, disagreements will happen, but it's not at the expense of others because different people can have different strategies, but the different people can have different strategies. Motor preservation is not saying that how people should relate to each other, but it's just saying that people ought to relate to each other in the first place, which answers on this argument and also proves that we doesn't have negative effects on each other's, and it's not just us being woke, because it's sort of an analytic in how we ought to approach things like the race war in the first place. The arguments of the language doesn't put black people in the back burners. The infiltration arguments are inevitable insofar as that logistics has already infiltrated the university and will sort of promulgate those forms of violence. But we return because motor preservation is a question of after those forms of infiltration happen, what do we do? What do we take? The race war, the we don't understand arguments are probably going to be answered on the permutation later, and the visibility stuff will be answered on the K further down. The individuation decided how you should evaluate this K. The alternative lacks an accountability mechanism for how non-black people, because non-black people can co-opt, reinterpret, and carry out violence in the name of redaction. Our argument is not that you should be responsible for how non-black subjects respond, but rather the absent analytic that forces them to come to terms with things like the race where whiteness fills the gap. This is empirically proven by the COINTELPRO example in the 2AC, and proves that only the act offers an accountability mechanism, because even if our performance is transparent within the academy, it forces other non-black subjects within debate to come to terms with anti-black desire systems, which is a massive link turn to the King evidence they run in the 1C. Also solves racial battle fatigue, which is a massive external impact, because absent this analytic, we're left to turn inward, which can be psychologically violent and gives non-black debaters to reinvest against non-black debaters to reinvest within their own libido desires rather than disinvesting from a system of logistics. That's a massive external impact that outweighs the impact to any of their links. That also means that contingency is a good frame, because their critique is largely a description of how the status quo operates at the macro level, but that doesn't trade off with how we can come together in moments of being indebted to one another, which creates social energy to grapple with anti-black cause not only out there but also in here in debate, the permutation debate. There are arguments that redaction is a practice where that it's compatible, because there are always incomplete moments in our politics that can be resolved into the line by line stuff here. Yes, we do get permanent method debate. Otherwise the practice or ability to best sort of create the strategies to combat the race where the competition ahead is bad as I answer by this argument, because it's not that method is not that firms are good for competition, but rather to create the best and sort of most strategic practice to combat the race with the accountability arguments and the accountability arguments are relying upon us shifting goalposts. We hear about the affirmative, but it probably links more to them in terms of reduction. The whole expression labor is that no, if we want our framework arguments, if we want our framework arguments, which will be later, it's not a question of sort of the production of labor within the academy, but rather the analytics that we take to our politics in the first place. Yes, people will disagree with what we mean, and disagreement in how sociality looks like it's inevitable, but understanding the race war forces non-black folks to center the experience of black people, which is at least a linear decide to the alternative in terms of entanglement, but being mode and harnessing these instances of disagreement and incompleteness are inevitable, but it's at these, but they're sort of able to create cracks within the system of logistical capitalism, which is solvency for the affirmative and is actually the alternative, and sort of answer the double bind argument. I'll answer the links here. The first link about resiliency, we've impact turned it. It's not us, we've impact turned it. But first, it's not us. It's not about living to fight another day within the map of logistics, but rather how the description of the race war allows us to understand how we can create moments of sociality within it. Logistical capitalism makes co-option inevitable, but community building can create a way to build alternative worlds and fight back. Also, they consider the Mueller evidence that black and brown students fighting the race war have no choice but to bounce back, because this process is able to resist the will to individuation that logistics pushes onto them. This technical transparency link, we've straight turned it. The hypervisualization argument, the performance of logistics is inevitable, and so is the university, because logistics is always around us, especially in the context of the performance of the act. And spaces like give a hypervisualization of the violence is the status quo, but they've dropped the macro-micro distinction, which is also a reason why reading the act is good. The Butler evidence is that every ballot is sort of a cognitive linguistic act that is not set in stone, but rather something that can be rewired, i.e. the code works us and we work the code, which means that reading it in debate is good. The framework arguments are sort of going to be the last thing that I answered, but it also should sort of broadly take care of any links they have to the performance of the affirmative, because it should not solely be a question of performance, but also how those analytics are something that we take with us outside of debate. Outside of debate, it's not just a question of research practice, but how theories operate in the world. We've read a Moten piece of evidence that it's important for those moments of deliberation to understand not only what is happening, but how we are able to bridge to the struggle, which answers the presumption argument that the link you lose model is bad, because it halts our ability to translate our politics in the first place. The complicated validation argument is answered by the entanglement. It's not because there's a higher risk of the alternative reproducing violence, because when our analytic in debate is redacted whiteness fills in, which gives non-black debaters the incentive to export the alternative in violent form when times comes in anti-black forms. Anything else? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to give Kenny some prep time for the tuner. I think that there are a lot of good things about that 1AR. The thing that I am most interested in is the thing that I suspect will be a big deal in the 2AR versus 2AR, which is this concept of portable skills and the kinds of things we can learn in debate and how those things translate to the real world. I think it's the bulwark of a lot of the AFs offense against the alternative is I think that there's some argument to be made about how the next position perhaps doesn't allow debate to achieve its maximum potential as a place to inculcate skills. I think the negative's response to that would obviously be something along the lines of that potential actually gets siphoned by the university in ways that are insidious and can be very dangerous for debaters, particularly Black debaters, and that not having the same perspective can cause you to just talk about things that you haven't experienced and then believe you could do something about them. But in any case, I think that that was a really good place to kind of return to a bunch of different times. I think that's something that this 1AR does well. Its coverage is difficult and it's hard to know exactly what the 2NR will go for, especially given how many case arguments there were in the 1NR. But I think that returning to a few key points of difference in several different places in the 1AR is a kind of reinforcement tactic, and that repetition is going to set up the 2AR to go for the best version of their argument. Daniel, I know you mentioned to me you wanted to talk about some coverage stuff. I thought coverage was challenging for this 1AR for sure. What, as a 2A, if Shreyas was giving this 1AR and you had to give a 2AR, what kind of would you have wished happened that didn't quite connect?
Yeah. So, well, I would preface this by saying that, especially for the 1AR, a lot of what you need to cover, I think, should ideally happen in a conversation with the 2A during the prep for the 1AR, so that they know exactly what you want to go for as a 2A. And I thought Shreyas did a good job, and maybe this is like just specific to me or based on like the feedback that I have gotten, but I thought that maybe we should have spent more time, or Shreyas should have spent more time on the case debate, because a lot of the arguments there were very in-depth, very layered, and had a lot of preempts for the 2AR. And so I think the phrase like, it'll be on the K gets a bit confusing, even if it actually is on the K, because oftentimes debaters like miss where it might be. But I do agree that, some of the line by line portions, the ticky-tacky little bits, aren't that important for the 2NR and the 2AR, because obviously the 2NR can't go for all 13 minutes of the block, and the 2AR has to answer the 2NR, not necessarily the block. So a lot of the little things aren't that important, but I think spending more time on the case debate that was so layered would probably have been more helpful.
Yeah, and I think that what we were talking about a little bit earlier, how even like the very best, most successful debaters, and I think that Shreyas and Het are an example of that, successful at the very highest level, that even when you have tremendous familiarity with your AF, it's really hard to give a 1AR versus a really in-depth case press where you just talk extensively about a couple issues, because these aren't the kind of debates where you could just say, well, you don't have a card for that, or here's some evidence comparison, or you don't have uniqueness for this claim. Those aren't things that judges are going to be persuaded by in debates such as this one, that perhaps they would be in like a policy debate, for example. And so I think that the way that this 1AR tactic of kind of like covering by just putting ink on the flow for some of these case presses is about the best that Shreyas could have possibly done, given how robust the kind of case presses were in the 1NR. And I think that it could end up being totally fine. I think that I don't think that there were significant drops. I don't think that there were big technical errors by any means. I think the 2AR certainly has the tools to work with. And the reason for that is because Shreyas kept returning to the same kind of key distinction that if you notice was the key distinction that was explained at the top of the 2AC, which is basically what's the point of us being here? Why are we here? Why is the app a good example of the kinds of practices that we should have in debate and promulgate in debate? So I think that 2AR is still very much set up. But I think that this kind of demonstrates what happens when you spend a lot of time on case, and even if those arguments are analytic, they're still really tough for even the very best debaters to be able to deal with.
Especially on that point, I think last year, Vikas, my partner, also a speed demon like Shreyas. One of the pitfalls of that, though, is the tendency to overcover things and lose focus of the bigger questions that Shreyas kept returning to. because you're so fast, you can get through so many arguments. And so it also is important to, like you said, return to the central questions that will win you the debate, and not necessarily spend all of your time answering a little bit of things on that line by line. And so, there are pitfalls to being fast.
Yeah, I think that as someone who judged them a lot over the course of last season, I think that when Coppell really turned the corner and went from a very solid team who was always clearing to a threat to win every single tournament they entered, was that turning point was probably when Shreyas figured out how to weaponize speed into something that could be useful for strategic gains rather than just like being fast for the sake of being fast. And I think that probably happened somewhere around the Glenbrooks for them. And since that point, that's been a huge weapon in the arsenal. And I think that it's a lot of times we do speaking drills just for the sake of doing speaking drills without thinking about how to strategically utilize that speed. And so I think that that's something that we should think a lot about, especially in the context of online debate where speed can be tricky just because it's harder to flow than perhaps otherwise it would have been. Yeah.
And I guess the last thing is that, especially in online debates, it does get a little bit harder to flow, especially much faster debaters, and based on like varying audio qualities. And so doing speaking drills with the focus on clarity is also pretty important. So maybe if you don't have that purposeful speed down, being more clear is a lot better, especially in the era of online debate.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that attending some kind of summer camp where you just get a lot of practice debate. I mean, it's all going to be all about reps. I think that if you go to the first online tournament of the year with no online debate experience, you'll definitely be at a significant disadvantage. Whereas we could kind of figure out what the pitfalls are and know how to avoid them ahead of time to make sure that they don't keep happening. Something Het mentioned to me during this speech is the familiarity that Shreyas has with his AF. I think that's also something that came pretty clearly. There were a lot of different times in the 1AR where there was a seamless integration of key arguments that I think that just tons of repetition and experience has kind of let them know will end up being the important thing in the 2NR and 2AR. So Kenny, do you need a little more time, or are you good? I'm not sure if
I think we got the thumbs up. I think we got the thumbs up.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll stop talking now and going to hear the 2NR.
Are you on your Delph debate?
Yes, but you just want to show me your computer.
I know, but then it's gonna just.
Oh. What's that?
Which email is it?
Oh no, just my regular email.
Okay.
All right, so the order is going to be case, then the K. Did you send it to me?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Can I just read off your?
Oh yeah, sorry.
All right, case and case. Everyone good? You should frame this debate through the King evidence and the conceit of coal extraction there. Strategic inclusion and exclusion of particular textures of identity and relationality makes it impossible to vote AFN, turn to all their offense about why we come to debate and what people's role should be, especially when they have also concluded a top-level framing, concede a top-level framing question that you should refuse to call to pick and choose between strategies of resistance as non-black adjudicator. Every time the AF attempts to create a competition between the AF and the neg, you should it should be a reminder to just so Nick, because a Black person's ability to choose their own visibility, not the case to be proper. Didn't we say that AF was going to sound drastically different the longer we sit here about negative on presumption, the new articulations about the AF being for non-Black people feeling safety, or their links are harder to the king stuff because they ignore the ways in which relationships of Blackness are without something or material Black people can leave without parasitic attachments. Now, the K proper, the negative to reject the apathetic transparency, which ultimately is committed to the same project of logistical recognition. They criticize to facilitate the cycle of anti-Blackness by recreating a spectacle of surveillance and militant preservation in which Black flesh is accumulated over and over again, and which facilitates the industrial policing and policing of Black resistance technologies. Frame this debate through the process of capturing transparency, the one he utilizes, and which generates the uniqueness to all negative arguments in debate. This impact debate, it outweighs. There's two arguments. First is reproductive captivity. Anti-Blackness is about eradicating Blackness, but forcing it to signify symbolically the one and dar. It's great in this argument. It's in the ways in which Black people are used as the kind of embodiment of why not Black people and white people should embody militant resistance, but ignore that when those things are embodied, they become hyper-visible subjects attached to Black people, which only recreates the second level of the argument, which is neoliberal biopolitics, in which the goal of Black resilience is the goal of Black resilience to recreate contemporary neoliberal markets, in which the goal is not eliminating insecurity, but instead facilitating creative destruction and never-ending opportunity. This is why on the framework level, the university and logistics to never argument isn't often so in the K, because it's not about how, because our criticism is about how we utilize and embody energy in those spaces of violence. They have a bad and transparent aesthetic in this debate, which means which makes insecurities in the neoliberal market, the neoliberal markets for the prison industrial complex and criminality against Blackness, inevitable anti-Black fungibility outweighs all the hapticality and entanglement claims, because Black visibility is always overdetermined in competitive spaces. That takes out absolucy and also links up to the role playing. The role playing the rest is that for me from the 2 and C. Now the link debate proper. The first link is counter hegemonic logic. They understand themselves, and re-achieve anti-Black tropes for a violent revolt in the age of digital policing. You have to theorize about a medium in which debate is held. Hypervisibility online has never been built for Black people to think there's no concrete point of accountability. They say the app is about pedagogy, but in debate space, what does that mean for engagement, especially in terms of Black organizing? All these the second link is transparent logic. The impact is the facilitation of anti-Black surveillance, advocating for militancy and pedagogy of abolition through transparent means obscures any uncommon potentiality. Decay outweighs because racial capital and makes fungibility of Blackness inevitable to control the afterlife within the afterlife. Afterlife and slavery, the afterlife and slavery. The last argument on the live outline is the extinction of the individual dissent. I'll do it now on the alternative debate. You should understand that not only does the permutation link them to the cold extraction dissent, but the individualization dissent is the reason why the permutation fails, because because their understanding of debate as a space in which there are multiple heuristics for understanding the world only recreates it when the only way that those things can be spread is through voting affirmative. Our argument is that this creates a parasitic attachment to resistance strategies that only redaction can solve. Now, only redaction can solve the permutation. The permutation also doesn't solve because they concede. They also doesn't solve because they conceded that the permutation only creates competition between resistance strategies that get co-opted within new spaces within new spaces. The mobilization of the 2 and R on the level of the alternative. The 2 and R you should frame the 2 and R through understanding redaction as the embodiment of the suspension of decision and accumulation that renders Blackness fungible in spheres of transparency. Redaction does not render or seek to repair said relationality, but instead understands how to harbor and embody the energy in spaces of violence. Any risk we win a link is a uniqueness to claim with alternative outweighs and turns the ass logic of refusal evaluate impacts in a vacuum. Their method method, not the theory. They can't win. They can win if they theorize violence, correct? But if we win, they only add to the liberal university death drive. You should vote negative because the redaction solves through the consumption of cooperation of their politics, which is good because the only reason why the app is good post 1AR or post 2AC explanation is that it is a good way for accountability to be had. Our argument is like that accountability does not have to be presented in a transparent way that over-determines other resistance strategies. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that the 2NR kind of emphasized some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier in terms of the accountability arguments and transparency arguments. I think that's something the 2NR is doing successfully, is creating clear differences between the one key distinction between the two approaches to dealing with violence. And I think that the thing I perhaps liked most about this 2NR is the way that Kenny consistently references arguments in terms of both the framework stuff and also general framing, which kind of keys in for judges what they should think is important and what to emphasize on. So I was thinking, so Daniel, you mentioned that there was some like lining up arguments was a little bit tough when you were flowing. I was wondering, as a 2A, when the 2NR collapses to a few key arguments, and this is something that happens all the time. I think this is a really common approach to getting the 2NR, where you just focus on a couple of links that you're going for, maybe one link, and lining up things to the 1AR becomes a secondary concern. When you're AF, how do you deal with that as a 2A? Because I think that sometimes it can result in an organizationally incoherent 2AR because you're trying to maintain 1AR structure while also answering 2NR depth on a few things, and it can end up just being a mess. So like, what do you do? What is your approach to dealing with that?
I think there's two situations where the approach I would take kind of differs. So one is where if the 2NR collapses, and I guess there's actually three situations. So one is where the 2NR collapses and they come to the same central question that you do in the 2AR. In that case, it's like relatively easy because both of you have a different interpretation, a different answer to that central question. And so whenever you get done with the case debate, you're like, okay, then you're like, we agree that the central question in this debate is this and this. And then you give your take on it, and then you answer theirs, and then you go down. And the 2AR, because it's the last speech, you don't have to line things up exactly. So you can almost pick and choose what you think are the most important. But the important part about that is giving a reason why that's the most important and why the things that you may have not gone to or not spent as much time on don't matter nearly as much. And usually that's framed through whatever that central question is. So that's the first situation. The second one is where your two questions that you sort of identified as central to the debate don't really line up. In that situation, a lot more of the 2ER needs to be sent on why whatever the negative have said doesn't matter as much, because if the negative team is good, and it should be, they have identified something that's more beneficial to them. So where maybe you have undercovered something in the 1AR, and so a lot of the 2AR then needs to be spent making up for that time and having offensive reasons as to why whatever thing that you have identified as important is the most important, and whatever thing that they have identified is not important. The last situation is where like the 2NR is a bit more robotic. They get up, get their overview, and then just line by line straight down the 1AR. In that case, the 2AR has a lot more leeway to change things up and frame things in the most important things to them. So in that sort of style debating, that technical versus like ethos-y debating, the 2AR should really like lean into that ethos, especially if they think they're being outspread by the 2NR, and sort of pick and choose exactly what it is that they think is most important, because they know that they won't necessarily win the little bits of the line by line.
Okay, so it sounds like in all three of these 2ARs that you've laid out, so version 1 being we largely agree on the central question, but have a different answer. 2AR number 2 is we disagree about what the central question is. So the 2AR is more or less about persuading the judge that your central question is the correct one. And then 2AR number 3 is it's a highly technical debate, which gives the 2AR an open window to introducing ethos into the fold. It sounds like in all three of these 2ARs, you think that the thing that is a marker of a good 2AR is focusing in on one, maybe two at most, but really just like one central position to take, and then building everything out from that one central position. Do you think that, how much is that planned beforehand? Like how soon in the preparation process do you know what that 2AR central question is going to be? Do you know before the debate starts? Do you know before the tournament? Do you know after the 2NR? Like when in your mind are you like pretty sure that you know what you're going to say the central question is, and you know what type of 2AR you're going to give?
Yeah, that's definitely something that should be done before the debate. So I think the most important thing I really learned that helped me get a lot better at debate is that you should think about the speeches from the 2AR backwards. So you should know what your 2AR strategy is against a certain position, and your 2AC and even your 1AC should be catered specifically to give that 2AR, to give you the tools necessary to give the ideal 2AR. Now, obviously, some like execution errors, maybe some discrepancies in speed, or some just technical things that you might have messed up during the debate might change that plan. And so I think the most important thing is, of course, the thinking about the 2AR before the debate, but then the second most important thing is finding that little bit of adjustment for technical mistakes in comparing the 2NR versus the 2AR. So definitely before the debate begins, you should have a good idea of what the 2AR should be and have a good template for how they should go about it.
Yeah, and we'll let Heck give the 2AR in a second, but I just want to emphasize that point that sometimes mistakes occur. Debate is really hard. It wouldn't be fun if it wasn't, and having experience dealing with complications is important, just getting in lots of practice. I think that one thing to note is if you're a 2A who's struggling in some of these conceptual debates, part of that struggle is often an overcorrection to perceived 1AR or 2AC errors that you might have made, or perceived brand new developments that might happen in the 2NR. I think the thing to remember is that you may want to have small tactical changes in how you're explaining something, but the 2AR should stick to the game plan. Almost always, I think you'll find that the very best 2As maintain a central focus on what they believe the debate should be about, and don't deviate from that because things aren't going so well. Because as soon as you start deviating from that plan, the judge will key in on that and know, and will be able to perceive, even through an online format, your lack of confidence in your own position. And so doing what you do best and sticking to that central message will make you sound way better and more confident, and will allow the 2AR to overcome a lot of earlier problems in the debate. And never forget that if you're a 2A, you get to speak last, which means there's no such thing really as a debate that's unwinnable. It only becomes unwinnable once you start changing your central focus because you've made some mistakes. Okay, Het, we're ready for you when you are.
The order will be the case page proper, and then the K. At the top of the K, there will be like an overview. I was just going to flow that on like the 2NC overview sheet. Okay. Is everybody good? Yes, cool.
The race war is real and happening now. It's time to choose an analytic vote affirmative to adopt military preservation as a politics of being together, racial terror, recognition of indebtedness for each other, create sociality through affective relations and fights that follows through feeling each other, others through feel you, for you to feel them, feel you, literally creating better resonances spaces for debaters. Here and now, there's 4 arguments to the king argument that were not handled very well. First is that entanglement is inevitable, i.e. their relation to each other can only be understood in how we relate to one another, because those relationalities are already formed, but it's a creation of how we analyze those relations and how we understand them through the analytic of debt that forefronts of violence that happens during the race war, which is net better than the alternative, because it would just be the status quo, which is the continuation of such practices. Second is that AF as a prerequisite doesn't pick and choose the strategies that Black debaters or others should do during the race war, but says that it's a prerequisite to analyzing the world in order to come to a better understanding and garnering the social energy that's able to allow them to choose in the first place. Third is that they've dropped the king parasitic arguments, link way more to them than they link to us. They've conceded that vacuum whiteness fills in there means that there's an incentive argument argument here, i.e. there's an incentive for non-Black folks to either A, turn towards their own anti-Black libidinal desires, which reproduces anti-Blackness, or B, carries rejection towards the direction of whiteness, which always allows it to co-opt, which I'll do on the K debate proper. Fourth is they've conceded the neurological rewiring argument, which means that this argument doesn't make much sense because there are psychological changes to direct neurons away from the desire to have anti-Black investments. That's the Butler evidence towards sociality, which is the net benefit to the app because it means that people have the social energy to grapple with parasitic forms of violence that happen in the first place. Next, and lastly, is the presumption argument. They've conceded that having a telos, i.e. having a complete project is bad. It's only in plain incompleteness that we find completion, which allows us to create those modes of sociality, i.e. it doesn't ignore relations, but says that those forms of relationality should be incompleteness because that is when we find each other in those moments. Second is that it is material, i.e. the social energy and the heuristic that is used to the world are material paths that debaters export out of this space, which is the key link term to the K. Go there now. Massive individuation to set to the alternative that only the perpetuation solves extends you both here. The embracement of indecision without a direction to our politics is violent. The idea that an analytic that's interpretable is surveilled is a dangerous one that greenlights white supremacy, redaction, refusal without an analytic of debt for each other for no reason other than intrinsic value that untangles white supremacy as per the King evidence creates a void that is filled with white supremacy. The idea that it is exactly the point that the alt remains a secret allows whiteness to misinterpolate it to perpetuate violence under the guise of staying woke off the grid. Double agents that have no direction because the alternative remains in the dark. They've dropped the example of members of the FBI that infiltrated the Black Panther Party, provoked violent actions. That alone turns their surveillance arguments and the rest of the critique, because it proves their alternative generates agents of the race where only the app provides an accountability mechanism for non-Black subjects to build a heuristic to understand the world. A form of care and love is what their own mode evidence describes as a deconstruction that only moves in relation to reconstruction, but that reconstruction is never able to generate under an alternative that has no direction. The impact of social energy, which is also dropped. Contingent modes of resistance at the micro level are good. It's a thesis claim that every tuner argument that has missed broader antagonisms or inevitable adds to surveillance, but our performance exceeds the ability to be captured. It is in our moments of coming together that we're able to find energy, which is a key. Dropped internal link redaction leaves an inability to communicate about modes of politics and destroys an analytic depth for each other, which forces us to fight for ourselves and turn inwards, which is one, psychological violence, and two, short circuits the ability for the alt to resolve its impact, the line by line proper. The top level stuff about redaction, surveillance being accumulated in the status quo. Again, these are all links to the status quo, which was done above, but saying that policing and captivity happens, they've conceded that we have a solvency mechanism to solve it, i.e. sociality creates the bondages that it stop those moments of sociality in the micro level, which I'll do on the link debate proper. I'll do that here. First is the counter-hegemonic link framing. The micro-macro distinction is important because it's a straight turn. At the level of the micro, logistics are inevitable, especially in the context of the university, because hypervisualization is everywhere, but it's only true insofar as the macro. Top level is that if it is inevitable, redaction does not solve. They've dropped it is better to be of and not in the university, create neural blockings with cracks and fissures. The app is key to providing an analytic to understand the world that can be exported to form judgments outside of it. Anything else upholds the status quo. Western education creates a leave the race war at the door mentality, balance and logistics to infiltrate our politics at the level of form. Only clash over those things is key to broader perspectives and heuristics and to warrant to wide debating and introducing it in debate space is good. These are not specific strategies as the tuner would like you to believe, but it's a cognitive mapping for interpersonal moments, which does not decide what those politics should be, nor does it reveal what those politics should be, but provides a platform for those politics to take place in the first place. They say that it's bad to be it is bad to be transparent. They've conceded that it's not the impact is not unique because it's to the status quo, i.e. our analytic of debt is not transparent insofar as you can't co-opt relationality and how we relate to each other insofar as you can't co-opt the alternative what is redacted. They say role playing. It's not a question of role playing. We haven't said that we ought to do something in this space, but rather we should understand how violence infiltrates the space and outside of it. They say you advocate abolition. This is the key distinction between what the tuner would believe you that the app is and what the app actually is. It is not a telos. It does not have a specific strategy for what we should do, but rather abolition as an ethos, understanding the world around us in order to provide an ability to understand us. Ramon describes this as understanding the world, but having a constant planning as opposed to a policy which flows affirmative. The individuation parasitic stuff that was answered on the case debate with the King evidence, but it's not parasitic to create blockages of those different blockages between people that allows them to come together and facilitates those moments of sociality, which is net better for creating social energy, which was above. The permutation increases competition. You have dropped the 1 AR warrant that perms are good during a race war because you would result in the own impact. Otherwise, method debates fracture solidarity by tearing people apart at the margins, and logic allows logistics to control our politics that turn care into competition against each other, i.e. that there is small differences, but we shouldn't come together to understand those small differences. And your model debate creates more competition between each other. The next argument about embodiment of repair, or you were trying to re-ender something. No, it is in our incompleteness that we find the energy to come together, which means it's not repair. We do not theorize the impacts to solve them, but rather society creates a heuristic to understand them.
All right, yeah. Okay, so this is great debate. Thanks so much for everyone for participating. I just want to say something briefly, and then I'm super interested in hearing what the four debaters thought of things. I think that this TRIR does a good job of focusing on a couple arguments, but more importantly, having a moniker to explain those arguments. Something I think that people don't think enough about is what will judges find easy as an explanation in their RFD. And so something like the AF isn't a telos, but it's an ethos. That's easy to remember. It clicks in your head. That's something I think that is a phrase that might appear naturally in an RFD. And you hear all the time, every debate coach says some version of write the ballot for the judge. And almost every time debaters have no idea what exactly that means. Like, does it mean you literally say, I voted AF because, or I voted neg because? Is it just that you win it? To me, the more I judge debates, I find that the way that debaters are able to write ballots for me is by including phrases and repeating those phrases that will stick in my head and will be the thing that I think about as I'm assessing a flow. Like, flowing debates is difficult. Not everyone's super good at it. And so you have to control for variables like distraction, difficulty flowing, missing something because of Zoom. And so repeating a few key phrases multiple times throughout the debate and in the 2AR as a filter for how to understand things, that's to me how you write the ballot for the judge. How you write the judge's RFD is by speaking in a way that is natural, because debate is about communication and persuasion. It's not just a technical game, and judges are human, not computers. And so I think that utilizing that to your advantage is something that I think both the 2NR and 2AR did remarkably well, and can be the entire difference in winning or losing a close debate. And a lot of times in deep elims, you might see a 3-2 or a 2-3, and it can be frustrating. The way to turn those, to flip that last judge, you know, if it's 2-2, the way to get that last ballot and win those super close debates is by being the team who has the most clear kind of lines to package their argument, and be the thing that 30 minutes after a debate ends, 45 minutes after, an hour after, a judge is still deciding, still looking at arguments, still reading cards. If that judge is still thinking about a phrase that the 2AR said, they're probably going to vote AF, because that's just like the thing that stuck most clearly. And that might seem like a silly RFD and might be a frustrating one, but if you want to turn those frustrating L's into wins that result in a look of frustration on your opponent's faces, if you want to flip that, then utilizing that tactic is I think the easiest way to do it. So I just like wanted to open things up to the debaters, like what you thought of one, debating online and partner communication, and then second, just like how you thought the debate went and what you felt was good to replicate. And anyone can feel free to talk first.
Okay, I can go first. I think that sort of like two interesting things stood out to me. First is just like in the context of communication, like we had like a phone call going, but we never really ended up using it. I mean, we were just like texting on messages. So like, I guess it's sort of dependent on what kind of team like you are, like if texting is easier. But I think like in the context of debate itself, and especially like the high school to college transition, is that college is a lot more sort of theory heavy. And it's important to, I guess, do a lot of reading, especially if like, you know, especially in the context of like Rev debates, sort of theoretical understandings plays a lot like important role, not only in like how judges determine the debate, but also how like the language that's being used in debates. And so I think that's sort of an interesting difference.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that it's pretty interesting as someone who just graduated. So like being in this weird era of the last generation to have probably in-person debates, which is something I would have never probably have fed, or, you know, but I think that kind of having this online debate was interesting because like there's the energy is still there in terms of partnership, like you said, right? Like, even though like we're not physically present in a room, I feel like immediately as we started the debate, like everything just kind of clicked and it felt like a normal debate versus like, you know, being in person. So, I mean, and I thought that like in general, you know, absent like kind of the weird technical difficulties, it'll be kind of interesting being a judge on the other side of this now that I've debated it.
Yeah, I kind of couldn't believe how much energy came through. I was not expecting that, but I guess if like
Already know DKP.
energy, it's I guess it's you. That makes sense to me. But I think if anyone, like there are a lot of concerns with online debate. We won't get into them too much here. But if one of your concerns is, well, I rely a lot on ethos, I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to communicate that through Zoom. Just like watch Azja Butler give a speech on Zoom. And
Please stop. Like, I really don't need my head to be any bigger. It's literally a box. Hate that for me. I don't mean to like cut you off. Is that what you wanted to say?
No, that's fine. You go ahead. Yeah.
I also kind of misunderstood like what you wanted us to say. So I think like debating online is interesting, both judging it and doing it, because this would be my first time actually like doing it myself. I've like watched a bunch of these debates now. I do agree. I think like people who are really scared about like ethos and things that like the more performative aspects of debate, missing like people who read poetry or play music or things like that. I think honestly online might make it a lot more interesting. Like we can screen share, you can play videos, you can redact your, like the ability to see you, kind of like I attempted to do in the one in R. Like there's a lot of different things you can do. I talked a lot about with Kenny about like using voice modifiers. Like, I don't know, like, you know, those like really like cringy comic book, like evil, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I just like stuff like that I think would be like really cool, and like see what it does like online and like how we communicate, I think is really interesting. So I think there's like a world of possibilities. And I'm someone who like really likes the social and like in-person aspect of debate. But all of that said, I think like that also makes me excited for this like new kind of like exploration of, you know, what this has to offer. And yeah, like, I don't know. I wanted to retweet the thing that DKP said earlier about like judges like needing just like catchphrase things, especially online, because people's attention spans, bro, like in debate in general, like when you're watching debate, your attention span is like this. But like online, I can only imagine, because now it's like you're on your computer and you could be literally doing anything. Like I could turn my screen off and I could be going pee. Like you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. I just think that like that said, like it's important to really think about like how do you want to, I don't know, like get people's attention. I don't know. It's something interesting to think about moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. The speech-wise, I just wanted to mention one thing, because I know Daniel brought it up, was like the 2AR persuasion. So we talked a lot about emphasizing things and catchphrases. I think that something that Het does a particularly good job in this speech is also using natural voice intonation. I think sometimes we get so caught up in going as fast as possible that you lose the element of your voice that is naturally persuasive, and you lose that rhythm. And I think that even if it means slowing down a little bit, maybe getting to one fewer argument, or having to trim down your blocks, in this Zoom debate setting, I think it was even more important to maintain a natural cadence. And something that I think that we'll think about a lot at debate camps is rethinking speaking drills, perhaps away from maximizing speed to maximizing efficiency in terms of maintaining a natural cadence and rhythm for communicating, because otherwise it just becomes so hard to hear. I think we just haven't heard from Het. What are your kind of last thoughts? And then if anyone has like a last thing to say, feel free to say it. If not, this was really awesome, and thank you so much for participating. I think everyone did a really good job, and I think this is an example of what high-level critique debates could become possible in the criminal justice reform topic. I think it's going to be a topic that facilitates a lot of these types of discussions. And so if you feel a little bit lost in terms of how to approach topic research, I think watching this debate hopefully put you in a good direction for that.
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of what you just said about, at first it's easy for someone to be like skeptical of online debate. It's a lot different than what we would do, like, you know, in person. But a lot of the aspects, or like the core aspects of debating itself, are still there. Like, you would assume the same structures that happen. And one thing that I was thinking that's even more important online, like you said, with catchphrases, is just general organization. Because as many people have said, like, your attention span's like really, really like little. So putting your important arguments at the top, maybe saying them one more time somewhere down the flow, saying them maybe in shorter words that aren't just like a ramble that's like 2 minutes long and gets to the point in 1 minute and 30 seconds and then repeats it a couple times. And emphasizing those things in at least the later speeches helps a whole lot. And I think that it's gonna be a little tough to choose and pick and choose those things, but practice for how you give speeches online, how like the audio quality comes out, is definitely gonna make this just as great as it would be in person.
I agree. Okay, so do we have any kind of final thought or? Okay, all right. Well, thanks for participating, and if you're watching, thanks so much for watching. If you have further questions about this debate or interested in materials, we'll have speech talks up, but also feel free to email me at cardstealing@gmail.com. It's my debate email, and yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
It was really awesome debating you all. Great job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great debate.
Got you on the circuit, you know? No. All right, later, everybody.
Hi, bye.
All right.